Hello everyone, I'm Alexandra and I'm back with more highlights from the last round in the Women's Speed Chess Championship and hopefully also highlights in your day today. This game was played between Grandmaster Valentina Gunina from Russia, a three-time European Women Chess Champion, and Grandmaster Irina Krush, a seven times US Women Chess Champion. Ultimately, Valentina won the game 24-5, but I think the three moments I'm going to highlight are very instructive for all of us. So let's get started. In our first game, we have Valentina as white against Irina as black. Currently, it looks like Valentina has a slight advantage, maybe even a crushing advantage depending on how you play this position. She's currently up a pawn, even though e4 is about to hang. She has the immediate threat of rook c7, putting pressure on the b7 bishop, as well as the f7 pawn. On top of that, she also has a superior pawn structure with two passed pawns on the queen side. This is not an easy position to defend as black. Here, the critical decision is whether to take on e4 with the bishop or with the rook. Irina unfortunately made the mistake of taking with the bishop, allowing for queen e3 to put indirect pressure on the e5 pawn. The immediate threat here is f3, which forces the bishop to move and loses the pawn on e5. If the bishop moves, which is what ended up happening in the game, queen takes e5 is putting pressure on the rook and also just putting black in a position where she is very likely to get checkmated. Other options here of defending are not so simple because f6, which defends the e5 pawn, also creates a weakness and an open rank on the 7th, rook c7, king g8, queen h6, threatening checkmate, and there's no way to stop it here. Let's go back. The best move here would have been to continue with rook d2. Sometimes the best defense is offense. Rook d2 puts pressure on the e2 bishop. White cannot take on e4 because rook takes e2 is both defending the square on e5 as well as the pawn on f2. Instead, if white plays something like bishop f3, then once again it's starting to get pretty tricky for black because she cannot take on f3 because of queen takes e5. Let's say the king moves to h6 to try not to get checkmated on the back rank, then queen f4, king g7, rook takes f3, white is just in a superior position here, up a pawn, and likely to grab another one or promote the pawns on the queen side. So what should have been played instead? So what should have been played instead? Rook takes e4 was the better option here, the idea being that she is putting pressure on the e2 bishop. If white continues with rook c7, then there's the move rook f4, which both defends the pawn on f7 as well as double attacks the queen on f3. The queen has to move somewhere where it's still protecting the bishop, whether it's on e3 or on d3. Black can continue with rook e4 and keep white in perpetual here. If instead of playing rook c7, white continued with rook e3 to block the threat of rook takes e2, then black can simply play rook b4, creating a discovery attack on the queen and preparing the move bishop d5 to put more pressure on the b3 pawn in case white decides to take on e5. This was a much harder variation to find, but it just shows that sometimes you should put as much effort into drawing a position as winning it. Irina definitely had a very tough position to play with time pressure, but I thought this was a game we could all learn something. In this game, we once again have Valentina as white and Irina as black. Valentina is up a pawn here, but Irina has the bishop pair and the open c-file, not the open c-file, but she's putting a lot of pressure on the c-file as compensation. Irina continued with queen b4, attacking the knight a second time, forcing Valentina to move her rook and defend it. She couldn't move the rook from the a-file because it was protecting the a5 pawn. This gave Irina the opportunity to activate her rook from the f square to d8. This move looks like it's very active and that it puts pressure on the open file, but it also has the very sneaky threat of preparing rook d1. You'll see what I mean by that a little bit later. Valentina continued with h3, trying to give her king some space and get rid of back rank mate threats. Irina continued with bishop takes c3, to which Valentina fell in the trap, immediately taking the bishop on c3 and allowing the move rook d1, which after rook takes d1, she loses the queen, and if white would have continued with king h2, then she would have taken the queen and won the rook on a1. Let's just quickly go back and see what Valentina should have done here. She had the very nice rook a4, which forces the queen to move away to c5. White gets the bishop on c3. Irina regains the pawn she was down, but this position is a lot better for white than what happened in the game. Nevertheless, it was pretty tricky to see. I hope you guys enjoyed this nice tactical game, and let's move on to my last favorite moment of the last match. For our last game today, we again have Valentina as white and Irina as black. Here, Valentina is putting a lot of pressure on Irina's king, and it's not obvious how to defend it. The ideal moves were either g6 or f5. Instead, Irina continued with h6, likely underestimating the bishop takes h6 idea that Valentina continued with. This is a very common strategy we see, where one side will sacrifice a minor piece for 2 pawns on the king side to open it up and give chances for attack. Irina continued with queen c5, trying to trade off the queen and diffuse the pressure on the king side. Of course, Valentina was not interested in a queen trade here. She continued with queen h4. The cool idea here being that Irina can eventually play bishop f5 to try and defend or trade off another piece to not have such a deadly attack on the king side. Here, Irina played g takes h6, which might look like a good move because she is capturing the bishop with a pawn, but unfortunately, she should have just left the bishop on h6 and her pawn on g7, because opening up the king just leads to a loss here. Valentina continued with queen takes h6. Irina tried to block off the checkmate threat with bishop f5. Here, Valentina was able to bring in more pieces with rook ae1, another very common idea we see in these kinds of attacks, with rook lifts on e3 and then threatening to either play rook g3, or if that's not possible and the bishop is not attacking the h3 square, then rook h3. Irina traded off the bishop here. C takes d3, tried to bring in her knight, but it was too late because after knight e5, rook h3 had the checkmate threat of both queen h7 and queen h8. Really no way to stop both of those, so Irina resigned here. I hope you guys enjoyed these games and you are enjoying watching the Women's Speed Chess Championship. Overall, I'll be here again after the next match to cover the highlights. Hope to see you guys again. Thanks.